Hello, my name is Ariadne Blayde. I am a writer, I'm a storyteller, I'm also a tour guide here in New Orleans. I work for Haunted History Tours. I have the very fun job of getting to give ghost tours and cemetery tours in and around the French Quarter. And tonight I'd like to read to you a little story that I've written. It's a short story. It's actually adapted from a Louisiana folk tale that I like to tell on my tours sometimes. This story is called Henry and Eleanor. Back in the days when life was hard and death came knocking before most folks were old enough to walk, there lived an inexplicably happy couple in the French Quarter of New Orleans. Their names were Henry and Eleanor. She pretty as a picture, he handsome as could be, and despite the difficulties of the time, they were terribly, overwhelmingly in love. Theirs was the kind of love that made folks want to shake their heads and say, well, that's just not fair. But it was such a pure love, such a kind love, that no one could really find it in their hearts to begrudge the couple their happiness. One winter, though, in that deep, damp cold down there in New Orleans, Henry caught pneumonia. For weeks, Eleanor sat up with him through the night as he struggled to breathe, feeding him good warm things and soothing him through his coughing fits. And thanks to her tireless care, he survived. They spent the spring picnicking and strolling on the levee and talking of all the good things to come, of a fine little house, and a couple of good, hardworking horses, and maybe their first little one by the end of the year. But then, that summer, the fever came. Every May, soon as the weather turned hot and vaporous, folks would start to drop like flies. They called it Yellow Jack, and no one knew what caused it. Those that could afford to leave town did so in those sweltering months, stayed away until death's hand had become a bit more discerning. Eleanor's folks had a little farm in Abita, and the couple planned to spend the summer there. But the night before their departure, Henry swooned in the parlor. Within hours, his skin had lost its youthful glow and taken on a sickly jaundice, his eyes straining yellow in their sockets. By the time the vomiting began, there was no denying that he had caught the dreaded fever. Bile, black as coffee grounds, poured out of him. A lake of sweat pooled under his pallid body, and in the delirium of the fever, he called over and over for Eleanor and begged piteously for her to come to him, although she was already sitting right there at his side, crying, kissing his burning forehead. Now, normally a man of Henry's constitution might survive Yellow Jack, young and strong as he was, but the pneumonia had robbed him of his full vigor, and he was weaker than he ought to be. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the fever had wrenched his last breath out of him. Henry was dead. It was early enough in the dying season that there were still undertakers to be found. Later in the summer, as the fever got greedier, there'd be too many bodies to collect and not enough willing men to transport and bury them all. And so they'd accumulate in the narrow streets, piles of corpses putrefying and bursting in the summer sun, outside homes where mothers sat vacant-eyed in dim, reeking rooms, waiting for the same death that had claimed all their children in less than the time it had taken to birth them. Eleanor was lucky in that at least her husband would have a proper burial, but perhaps she can be forgiven for not being particularly cheered by this small blessing. In a heavy black veil, she rode with the carriage as it trundled through the quarter to the cemetery, feeling in her bones each bump and jolt as the ragged streets jostled her husband's coffin. Henry was laid to rest in his family's tomb, a humble thing with a chipped stone angel atop. She sank down beside the tomb after they'd sealed up her beloved inside, her body racked with dry, crooning sobs. "Come home now," her relations said tenderly, but she refused to leave him. After an hour, they had to pry her away from the tomb and drag her out of the cemetery, her body limp in their arms. She returned to the cemetery the very next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. Months passed, but for Eleanor, the world had stopped turning the moment Henry had drawn his last breath. Eleanor, everyone agreed, was the saddest widow New Orleans had ever seen. She never went anywhere but the cemetery, never talked to anyone but the absence where Henry had been. Every day she came to sit and whisper his name, lying her face against his tomb and taking comfort in the feel of cold, smooth marble on her cheek. Then, one day, just after the first faint chill of winter had crept into the air, Eleanor visited Henry's tomb after a particularly restless night, and the cool breeze lured her into a dreamless sleep. Dusk fell, and the long shadows of the afternoon slipped away under the velvety mantle of darkness. The groundskeeper had not bothered to check for any lingering visitors, and Eleanor stirred at the sound of the cemetery gate creaking shut, the jangle of keys as she was locked in. And as she returned fully to consciousness, she became aware of a startling sensation, the touch of a hand on her cheek. She opened her eyes with a start, and there, sitting in front of her, his fingers stroking the gaunt hollows of her face, was Henry. Her Henry, not a specter, but Henry in the flesh, and not the rotting, decaying flesh of a man 6 months dead, but a vivacious, whole Henry, glowing and youthful as the day they had wed. "Henry!" she exclaimed, and threw her arms around him. They rested for several moments in a desperate embrace, and when they finally pulled away, their gazes shined with love and fondness and the sweet balm of reunion. "It is so good to see you again, my love," he said, and she wept tears of joy at this dream come true, the return of her dear husband. "You're not dead after all," she cried. His smile faltered. "I'm afraid I am, my darling. Ultimately, it's a rather irreversible process. But you're here, and I'm here, and we..." And then Eleanor realized that she and Henry were not alone in the cemetery. Outside the other tombs sat dozens of other people, all with the same youthful glow, talking and laughing in the lee of the hulking tombs. "Who are all these people?" she asked Henry with alarm. "Ah, you see, my love, those are the citizens of the cemetery, like me. They are the dead." Eleanor was bewildered at how lifelike they seemed, how animated their conversations. Well, they seemed to be enjoying themselves. "Yes, yes, they are. We are." It was then that Eleanor heard it. A terrible sound, a rushing, roaring, clattering sound emanating from outside the gates of the cemetery. "Here they come," a man at the next tomb shouted, and there was a buzz of anticipation as everyone else in the cemetery turned to look out the gates. Eleanor followed their gaze to catch the source of the noise, and there, past the gates, she saw it. On the dark streets outside the cemetery, there was a crowd, hundreds shoving and pushing as they passed each other in the streets. But this was like no crowd Eleanor had seen. They were not men, women, and children. They were skeletons, dry, brittle skeletons, a mob of them all rushing past in different directions, and the clattering sound was made by the bits and pieces of bones that fell to the ground and shattered to dust as they jostled each other in their hurry. Eleanor turned to Henry, horrified. "What is this terrible specter?" "Well, you see, my dear," Henry said, a bit embarrassed, "well, that is how we dead see the living. All of you rushing by day after day, each so anxious to win a race to where? Here." He gestured around at the cemetery, its rows of cold marble tombs. The vivacious dead had lost interest in the outside spectacle and had returned to their conversations, their laughter ringing in the dark. "And now that my race is run," Henry continued, "I realize I'm happier here than I ever was out there." "Happy?" Eleanor said. "Without me?" His face softened. "I miss you terribly, but we'll be reunited soon enough." "We will?" "Of course. So go and rejoin the race, my love. But walk, don't run. Enjoy the time you have left, because when you come back here, and I promise you will, we'll have an eternity to make up for that short time apart." Eleanor looked around at the other contented dead, animatedly telling stories of their happiest moments on the other side, the few times they had managed to slow down enough to savor it, to really see the world in all its beauty, to stop and truly listen to each other, care for each other. Henry squeezed her hand. "But you don't have to go right away. Not till dawn," he said. And so they spent the next several hours sitting together, reminiscing about the softest, sweetest moments in their short marriage, and promising not to forget each other until time's insistent march brought them together again. The other conversations gradually ceased as the night slipped into morning, and as the first fingers of light began to reach across the sky, Eleanor realized that the others had gone, faded away with the last of the darkness. Henry leaned over to kiss her one last time, and then he too was gone, disappearing as the sun's early rays suffused the cemetery in a tender glow. Soon enough, the groundskeeper was back, unlocking the gates, and as he shuffled into his little hut, Eleanor slipped past and out onto the empty streets. Back to the world of the living she returned, never to visit the cemetery again until her own race was run. And from that day on, everyone agreed Eleanor was the happiest widow New Orleans had ever seen. Thank you so much, everybody. Happy Halloween.